I I think I'm most interested in being uncomfortable. That tends to be something that I write about a lot in all of my blogs and all of my journals that I keep anytime I'm improvising or creating. Uncomfortability, I would call it. And I am using uncomfortability as a way to measure being uncomfortable. So I guess what I'm really interested in is how does uncomfortability relate to making in the moment or moment making? Mainly just improvisation as it relates to dancing. But I say making in the moment because that is what improvisation is. It's movement, and you're doing it in a moment at any given moment. So, how does uncomfortability relate to making in the moment? That's the question I'm interested in. In order to describe what I mean by uncomfortability, I think that I need to first talk about what even is being uncomfortable. And what I found is that being uncomfortable can be any sense of discomfort or awkwardness. And I believe that it can be something physical or emotional. I find that being uncomfortable can mean in yourself or in a situation. Personal example from the work that we have done in the improvisation class would be in the beginning when we were working on contact improvisation, and it was my first time being in physical contact with any of these people. Some of them I didn't even know their names, and I was very uncomfortable in the beginning, and I was unsure. I felt physical and emotional discomfort because contact improvisation takes a lot of trust, and I didn't even know who these people were. And so in the beginning, I felt very uncomfortable, and I had a hard time allowing myself to move through that uncomfortability to still make in the moment. I allowed the uncomfortability to hold me back. But by the end of the semester, when I was comfortable with the people and I did know their names and I knew more about them and I knew more about myself, I was more comfortable doing contact improvisation. But I could still find uncomfortability in ways of new scores and working with people that I hadn't worked with often before. But in this instance, the uncomfortability aided my movement. It allowed me to dig deeper within myself and find movement and moment making that I never would have found had I not had that sense of uncomfortability. So I'm thinking that uncomfortability comes in many forms and ways, and it depends on where you are, it depends on how you handle it. But what I found is that too much of comfortability can be a bad thing as well, because it doesn't allow you to break free from habits. Speaking of habits, I'm starting to think of the article Dancing in the Virtual and how the author said from habit to invention, from technique to improvisation. And I'm particularly thinking that this article talked a lot about technique, and so maybe uncomfortability is a technique that can be used in improvisation. I'm curious about that. I do think that it could be a useful technique, and I do think that it could aid in improvising. And if uncomfortability could be a technique, then also maybe it could be a form, particularly like in the article Composing While Dancing, where the author says that when someone improvises, they're composing the dance in the moment. And this form that they use will depend on where, how, and on what the improvisers are choosing to focus their attention to. So maybe by choosing to focus your attention on the uncomfortability and utilizing it, uncomfortability becomes a form that one can use in improvisation. Besides being something that can be used like a form or a technique, maybe uncomfortability is just related to identity. Like in the Riff Talk article, the people were using their identity as part of what they created. They didn't shy away from it, they allowed it to be part of them. And maybe uncomfortability is part of my identity. Maybe it's part of everyone's identity. And maybe we either choose to allow it or we choose to turn away from it. But either way, I think uncomfortability being part of an identity is something really interesting to think about. So maybe uncomfortability is a form, maybe it is a technique, and maybe it's just related to identity. But I know that what I've found is that for my personal practice, uncomfortability can hold me back and it can also propel me forward. And so it's something that I'm interested in, and I do think that uncomfortability as a measurement of being uncomfortable does relate to making in the moment or improvisation. And I think that it relates in individual ways for different people. And I think it relates in different ways depending on the day and depending on what the score is asking, and I think even maybe how you're feeling. So, yes, uncomfortability does relate to making in the moment, and it does so in many different ways, both positive and negative.